This is Salesforce Simplified, the podcast from Victoriam Solutions. Here's your host, Mike Boyle.
So nice to have you all join us again here on the Victoriam Salesforce Simplified podcast. Today's topic is managed services, real use case solutions. And my guest is Victoriam's own director of managed services, Joel Cajigas. Joel, welcome back to the podcast. Nice to have you with us.
Hey, Mike. Thanks for having me again. It's great to be back.
You were with us in August of 22 for any of those who would like to go back to hear that episode when you were joining us to talk about what a managed services program is. We're going to go a little bit deeper now and talk about some real use case solutions for managed services. But I don't want to be presumptuous. You know, there are folks who listen to the podcast who may not exactly know what a managed services program is. So just give us a broad overview, Joel, of an MSP.
So everyone's pretty familiar with the professional services side of engagements, where you have a defined scope, budget, and timeline, and you set out to accomplish those things under those conditions. A managed services engagement is one where we don't have those types of constraints. We'll set aside a budget, say 100 hours a month, and within those hours, we can pick things up as they come in. Right. And we can set roadmaps and plan work, but also have some flexibility to pick up those things that come up unexpectedly, or if we have to shift gears without having to, go through complex change orders or renegotiating scope or anything like that. We just reprioritize as it comes up.
And in the case of, what we do at Victoriam Solutions, our managed services programs help people with their Salesforce orgs and things that need to get done that they may not have the time to do, and the maintenance and the little projects that pop up from here and there.
Correct. We can pick up, those maintenance activities and the day-to-day support as needed, as well as, we can plan out to support customers that don't have the skill sets in-house to pick up work themselves.
All righty, so let's get into talking a little bit about some of the use case solutions that are available in a managed services program. Walk us through a typical scenario where a company might benefit from a managed services approach for Salesforce.
It's an interesting segue to this because there's different profiles of companies that benefit from a managed services engagement, especially in the Salesforce space. You'll have those companies who are looking to push the latest and greatest technologies in order to gain advantages in the market. So those types of companies are looking for experts in the space to drive them in that direction. You also have some companies that have their capable admins internally that just need some additional support for maybe specialized skill sets that they don't have, and they just want people to bounce ideas off of. And then you'll have customers or companies that are coming into Salesforce space in particular, and they just don't know where to go. And they're looking for someone to hold their hand through the process to help them get from point A to point B, or sometimes even visualize, where they can go. It's because all of these profiles exist that our Thrive team has matured to offer different levels of engagement that suit the different types of needs for all these companies.
Well, you mentioned Thrive. That is the official name of AdVic's managed services program, Thrive Managed Services. So talk to me about a client that has significantly been impacted, some challenges that they've faced, and how a managed services program like ours has helped them.
So we had a customer in the education industry. They had just started their Salesforce journey, and they were in that critical next step of trying to figure out where to go next. And one of the struggles they had is trying to define the next project, because they had these short-term needs, but they weren't sure what they wanted to pursue next. They didn't always know what was possible. And it's really hard to structure a project under those conditions. So instead of trying to bucket them into a project, our Thrive team came in, and our more flexible approach allowed us to pick up those short-term goals or quick wins that they needed to see that immediate benefit, while we were able to settle some of our road mapping sessions to plan out and help them visualize where they could go. allowed us to maybe plan out what maybe the next 2 years look like from their perspective and their goals and what we could accomplish. And then from there, that led to a number of different structured projects to get those things out the door while our Thrive team continued to help with the data support and the long-term vision.
Well, let's focus on a particular industry that AdVic serves, Joel. Can you share an example of a use case where managed services help a client in that industry to streamline a critical business process?
One of our partners sells highly customizable product sets, and their quoting process was incredibly manual and very time consuming for their sales team. So obviously, they set out to bring all that business logic into Salesforce to assist with the process. Our Thrive team's expertise in the particular industry was one of the driving points of us being able to work with them. Obviously, this was an intense effort because the product sets were so large and the number of combinations possible is in the thousands. And the other complicated portion was that we then had to present it back in very neatly in a quote document. So our long-term knowledge of their org, as well as the industry and how to navigate that, allowed us to be the ones in the driver's seat with our particular customer and some of their ancillary partners that manage other systems that we had to pull in together. Ultimately, we settled on a very thorough testing process to make sure that all the possible permutations were accounted for, and it led to a very streamlined rollout. And this was an engagement that took over 2 years to get from the beginning to the end, but it was a very successful one.
Integration is always a problem for companies. They worry about it. Can it be done? How do we do it? Talk to me about how your team helps customers with integrations for their Salesforce systems.
Integrations are very important because they're what connects the dots, right? And in today's day and age, most companies have more than one system that they use to operate, and that integration is key. One of our longest tenured customers had an integration in place, and there were always these little issues that kept coming up, and they were distractors. And unfortunately, some of our engagement hours were going towards, quick fixes or workarounds to this. Our team worked with the customer and say, hey, let's take a step back. Let's do a health assessment of your integrations. Let's map everything out, see the flow of data. And by doing so, we were able to identify some of the upstream limitations and issues that were being reflected in Salesforce. Once we were able to identify and kind of diagnose the issue, we worked with our partner, our customer, to put together a larger, more comprehensive corporate data structure and strategy to make sure that the upstream items are addressed, right? Because just because we're seeing the issues in Salesforce doesn't mean they're Salesforce issues. And so being able to pinpoint where in the process we have to make the fix is sometimes a challenge, but one of those things that our team prides itself in chasing and finding, right? Not the short answer, but the right answer.
Well, much like integration, data management is also at times a concern. Is it possible for you to describe a situation where the team helped a client improve their data quality and management through managed services?
Well, yeah, and they go hand in hand, right? Integration and data management are very important together. One of our largest enterprise level partners has over the years accumulated a vast amount of systems and tools to connect all their pieces, right? Obviously, consolidating that into an integration tool like MuleSoft was the first step. So we recommended a project, we got that going. Once the implementation was complete, we kept running into some issues on the data side, most of them data quality issues. So in a very similar fashion, we took kind of a step back. Let's follow the flow of data. And we found out that there was a governance type of issue where it's not the system so much as the controls in place to prevent or allow changes to be made. And because there's so many different systems that work together, if we don't have the right kind of control in place across all of the systems, a change in system A can create a problem in system B. And so once we were able to, again, figure that out and map it to our customer, we settled on, hey, your data management can be addressed through some governance structure. So we just kind of took a step back. We mapped their Wild West approach that they had in who owns what. We settled on a more streamlined version of that, and we have put the checks and balances in place to prevent changes that disrupt the massive integration system in place.
Well, from data management, the next thing to think about when you're thinking about plans for the future is scalability. Businesses grow. So can you talk a little bit about how managed services ensures a client's Salesforce environment scales to meet their growing needs?
Scalability is one of those tricky things to nail down in this particular business because there's no right answer for how and when we scale. We want everything to be super scalable at all times, but the reality is that building everything for the growth that may come carries some risks, right? If you're building for growth that never materializes, right? You spent resources into a system that did not recognize that growth or value. And so when and how is one of those questions that we kind of need to have our finger on the pulse on at all times. And so, our team focuses on value streams for customers, one of the key ones being scalability. So what we do is we bring best practice conversations, and we have those road mapping type of activities, kind of an eye on, hey, what are the projected growth targets, or how are we trending towards the established growth targets? Do we need to start making decisions on, hey, we might need to build over here. We might have to take a step back to grow this because now is the time. But it's finding that balance and the risk reward, because if we spend too much time making sure that everything can scale at any point in time or every time, all of a sudden you're maybe in a system that you never see that growth, and you delayed maybe some benefits for your team that prevented the growth in and of itself. So our team focuses on having the right conversations, because there's no magical equation that says now we need to be scaled, right? So let's keep our fingers on the pulse, let's stay connected and understand, is this the right time, and evaluate kind of the risk reward. And I think we're at a good point to pursue that. And so maybe the next quarter, we're going to focus on changes that allow us to scale versus efficiency gains.
Well, these days, Joel, as you know, it doesn't matter whether you're running a household or you're running a business. Cost effectiveness is always going to be top of mind. Can you maybe share a client story where managed services has helped them to optimize their Salesforce investment?
Well, one of the customers or partners that comes to mind is one that their main reason to join the platform was to streamline their billing process. They have one of those like mass billing cycles that happens maybe twice a year, 3 times a year at most. And these billing cycles are responsible for about 30 million in revenue, right? So they're massive. This is when they bill. And obviously there's a lot of human hours that have gone into it. With those human hours come the human errors, right? So streamlining it was important, but it's so massive that in one fell swoop, it's impossible to get all the business logic. So after their original implementation, the next time their billing cycle came up, there was still a lot of manual intervention necessary. Throughout that process, right, we were able to iterate once or twice with understanding where we still had those manual interventions, and our team was able to address those correctly, right? What is an exception versus what needs business logic? And I'm happy to report that maybe the last 2 cycles have gone from anxiety-inducing weeks of dread to an almost non-event. And it's freed up their team to focus on driving the business forward. So we're saving, every single time, maybe upwards of 400 or 500 hours of time spent just billing, right? Creating invoices and sending them. That has been streamlined, and it's allowed our partner to go chase other more exciting goals than that.
People might be a little bit surprised by this statement that managed services go beyond just the technology. Talk to me about an instance where our team has provided valuable strategic guidance to a client.
We had a partner reach out with kind of a typical conundrum in the space, which is, I call it the chicken before the egg sequence, right? The customer knows they need to change a process. They are not experts in the technology to know what it should turn into. And so if we're not careful, the conversation goes something like, hey, I don't know what I want, but I want to change it. What can it do? And then the technical side of the response to that will turn into, well, it can do just about anything. What do you want it to do? And so we can kind of go in that chicken before the egg spiral, and it wastes time and resources, right? So when our customer came to us with that, we kind of shifted our approach and just said, hey, let's try a more of a prototyping concept where the very first cycle is about establishing the objectives of the change you want. And then let us propose some very limited builds so you could see some of the ways that it can be addressed. And so after our first cycle, the customer saw a couple of the options, and we ended up settling on kind of a hybrid of 2 or 3 options. Once we had the approach down and what the context of the build would be, then we settled on diving much deeper into the actual requirements of the build in the context of what the solution would look like. And that really facilitated a solution that was not something that either of us thought of initially when we set out, but it really addressed all the issues that they had. And it brought benefits that weren't expected at the moment. The third cycle is making sure it's production ready. And then we rolled it out to production. But it was a process where asking the right questions in the kind of order necessary is what allowed us to get to the right technology. And it was a very engaging and fun process for everyone involved.
Last question I have for you, Joel, is, the philosophical crystal ball kind of a thing. But I think it's important that, as somebody who works with clients day in and day out in the managed services space, what do you see on the horizon, emerging trends in the Salesforce managed services space, and how are you preparing for them?
It's a great question, Mike. Looking back, the biggest challenge in maybe the last couple of years for managed services in the Salesforce space was dispelling the notion that it was just a support engagement. So that the last 2 years, it was about demonstrating that, hey, there's a lot of enhancement and building and guidance that happens and growth through managed services. And I think we've dispelled that notion. Now, looking ahead, I think it's about becoming a little more efficient and effective in that process. And while I think, going back to the point earlier, the technology, the build, we're getting pretty good, all of us, our customers and us, at understanding the development cycles for things to be built and turned around. But it's those ancillary parts of the process, the things that grease the wheels for us to pick up the work and complete it. There's maturity that needs to happen in that space, right? So what processes do we need to have for each engagement and customer to help plan or prioritize or fast track when we need to fast track, to scale some things back when there's uncertainty so we're not spending resources unnecessarily, understanding the risk tolerances and what we can go chase and where we need to be cautious, right? Building the structure around the development, that's where the maturity is coming. Our team focuses very much on those kind of governance level questions, and we invest very much in software development lifecycle capabilities as well as methodologies to be able to offer variations of that per customer, right? If every customer is a little different and they don't all have the same kind of resources or structures, well, then there's no one magical process or methodology that addresses everything every time for everyone. So our team is focused very much on having that flexibility to adjust our processes where needed and still within established methodologies. So it's not the Wild West or any crazy jungle version of this, but within those methodologies so that we can customize ourselves or be flexible to work with our customers and the things and the ways that make the most sense for them. And that is what I think the next couple of years look like. It's maturing as an industry, both our customers and us in that particular space.
Joel Cajigas, Director of AdVic's Thrive Managed Services. Thank you for joining us today. This was fun. I know I'm walking away with a much deeper understanding of how MSPs can benefit companies. And so thanks for coming by and giving us some real AdVic client use case examples. I enjoyed it. I hope you did too.
I had a great time, Mike. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure every single time.
I hope the audience enjoyed it as well. And speaking of the audience, if you want to learn more about today's topics, I'm going to be putting some helpful links in this show's episode notes to guide you a little bit more along the managed services road. I'm Mike Boyle from AdVictoriam Solutions. Thank you so much for joining us for the AdVictoriam Salesforce Simplified podcast. Our next episode, you got it. It's just around the corner.
You've been listening to Salesforce Simplified, the podcast from AdVictoriam Solutions.